Hi folks, today I'd like to show you some wet in wet technique a la Bonnie Steinsnyder. My approach with wet in wet is first I'm going to take my nice big 2-inch brush and put a nice bit of water right over the paper. So that's nice and wet, and I'm going to pick this up and just make sure everything got hit with the water. Now I'm taping the corners. This is not a block. This is just a pad. So I've taped the corners. It's nice and shiny on the surface. You can see that. So that's going to mean things are going to go psh. This is the time to put in some really atmospheric stuff in the background. So let's see. I'm not going to put a drawing on this. I want it to be kind of free. You can see how everything just really gets very loose. The water is pulling the paint off the paper. I can come in with a few different colors. If it seems to me that things are getting dried out, I can come in with extra water. I can come in with a sprayer, wherever my sprayer went. Ah, the joy of being organized. My sprayer just decided to go AWOL. Okay, so let me come in. I think what I'll do is drop in a little bit more of my magenta, just to get a sense of where things are going. I could have put pencil down, but I really wanted to keep things flowing. So you don't want to be too in love with a literal painting in this. You really want to keep things all about the movement of the water on the surface. And it's perfectly okay to take off excess. That's fine. Oh, and even tilting it can be quite lovely. You can always rearrange the tilts. Now, if I want to come in and start, well, actually, I think what I want to do is come in with more dark in this, give myself a nice sense of where the light petals are. Now, you don't have to do this with a dark background. You can just work within the flower itself. It's all good. I tend to like flowing in those greens. So, now there's another petal out this way. I think what I'll do is come in here. I just want to keep it loose. I just really want to keep it loose. So remember, if you tilt to flow the paper, okay, I'm tilting, I'm flowing the paper, everything that's wet is going to move. You're also going to get more sedimentation. So, you know, you might want to choose colors based on their sedimentation and what you want from that. So if you want a lot of sedimentation, yay, go for it. Go with cobalts, go with ultramarines, go with umbers. If you want something that has less sedimentation, go with your quinacridones, go with your phthalos. That's interesting. There was a flaw in the paper. Sometimes it happens. This is not fabulous paper here. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm pulling back into some of the light. It's all very wet on the surface. And I don't have to do a literal rendering of an orchid or a flower. A flower that shall be named later based on what it looks like. So I'm coming in. The thing that you have to be careful of, that you really have to be careful of when you work like this, is just coming over and over and over with really wet paint and then everything is just going to get gray. That's not as much fun. So as the painting is beginning to dry, I can even start coming in with some denser color. Now, I'm still, this has really strong color on the end of it with very little moisture. This brush is a synthetic. It's a low Cornell synthetic, and it just wants me to draw with it. It'll suck up pigment, but it won't take in as much water. So I can play with that. Sure, I can play with that. So let's see. I can come in there. Now this flower is probably beginning to dry a bit. That's a little green. Yeah, I tend to use a lot of brushes when I do this. I just don't want to have to keep rinsing and cleaning things off. So if it's the same color, it's not as much of a problem. Okie dokie, there we go. That's the light that I wanted. Okay, I had a slight fall of the camera. That was exciting. This is still wet. It's drying out though. So, I found my spray bottle. It's not as fine a spray as I'd like, but it'll keep things a little moist. So, if I'm coming in here with some more wet in wet dark. Ooh, I kind of like what happened there with the spray. So coming in here, I really do like what happened there. Okay, I'll take it. Happy accident, yay. Now what I just did was I sort of pushed in with the body of the brush and deposited pigment with the tip there. So I'm coming in, this is all direct painting. When I'm going wet on dry, I tend to plan on layering. When I'm going in wet on wet, I'm playing around with dense pigment, with dilute pigment. I'm trying to find how the paint wants to flow. Now, if it doesn't work out, you can just hold it under the sink and rinse some of it off. The staining colors will leave an echo of what was there. The colors that lift will just come right off, which is great. So, depending on your paper, if you have paper that's very absorbent, and some of the less expensive papers do this, it's hard to get some of those colors to come off. Now, let's see. I think this is still a little wet for me to spray and get what I want. So let me pull some of the color off. And this area here is already dry. It's just gone matte. So if I come in with a green in that area, it's probably going to go wet on dry. Let's have a look. Yeah, see, crisp edge, nice crisp edge, that's wet on dry. So maybe if I spray it, I can come in and soften that up again. Whee! I like being able to do that. So, yeah, this is getting into a little bit of a wet on dry edge. Still softening out a little bit. But if I really want that flow, I've got to have it wet. Now, as soon as I can get a little bit more dry in there, I'm going to show you how to do some blooms. Intentional blooms. Some people feel that blooms are not what you want because they're not controlled. I can do it over here. No, this is still my #1 place to do it because it's just beginning to dry. Let me get this big puddle out of here. Okay, I got that big puddle out of there. Now, if I want to force a bloom, if I want to do it through spraying, well, you just saw what I did with spraying. All those are little tiny blooms. I can do it even more intentionally. So just by flicking the brush there, I'm getting much more of a texture. So I've got that wonderful texture. If I used salt, it would have little specks in the middle and it would take an awful lot more time to develop. Wonderful thing though. I'll show you over there in a second. Let me show you an intentional bloom though, and I think I'm going to pick up some yellow to do this. So if I come in here, and I'm going to switch over to a green, phthalo green light. Now that has to develop, but what's going on here is that yellow went into an area that was beginning to dry, picked it up, pushed the color to the side, and now that yellow that I just dropped in is moving that initial layer of green. It takes a while for this to develop, and I know I want to, do something to make it hairy. It's not going to hurry. You have to be patient. Let's see. I wanted to do some wet and wet over here. I'll re-wet this with the sprayer. If I come way back from a distance, I can wet it a little bit more evenly. If I came really far back, I could use a piece of paper to block the areas I didn't want to re-wet. So, to come into that area with something like this. Now, this is still dry. It's, picked up a little bit of the sprayer, so it's breaking that edge a little bit, but I'm getting a dry edge there. So, I know I wanted to do this as a wet and wet demo, but I want just a couple of crisp edges. Just a couple. Humor me. Just a couple. So, if I come in there, drop in a second green, if I wanted to, this is too wet to throw in salt. There's still an awful lot of surface moisture here. So if you see, let me see if I can get, you can see it's soaking wet there. That's too wet for salt to handle. I need it dry, just a little bit drier, and then you'll see the difference between the sprayer and the salt. Waiting for it. Just waiting for it. I'll re-wet that area and put some magenta in, but I'm riding shotgun on this first. Now it's going to take a little bit of time to dry just because I've wet it several times. So let me put in some color. I wanted that other hint of a flower. And I will show you the same image that I've been developing wet on dry as soon as I'm done. Enough with this so that I can leave it. I can always come back in and develop it more with a wet on dry, or re-wet areas and come back in fluidly. This is something you'll see me do a lot, where I come in and I can pull up an area. Sometimes it just floods right back in. That's okay. Ooh, that was interesting. I went that way and I pushed surface water up into this leaf. Okay, now I've been talking for a while. This is still pretty wet. Okay, well, let's see what I can do. I'll amuse myself up here while that's drying a little bit more. Okay. Let's re-wet with a brush, just to show you the difference with a brush. Okay. I'm using a Sable round. It's got a little bit of color in it. So I re-wet that. And I'm going to drop in some very dense yellow. This time, instead of stroking with the yellow, just going to drop it in. Now this is Winsor yellow, and it has a tendency to push the color. So already I had cleared out some of the paper with that cleanish water. It was a little greenish, but it pushed some of the green away, and now the yellow is pushing even more. Okay, let's see. Meanwhile, back in the land of this shadow, it's still very wet. Let's see if I don't really want to tilt this, because I've got a lot of things going on here that are going to shift if I start moving the paper around. I could take my blow dryer and aim it in that direction, but I think that would be a little extreme for me. You can try it. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to take this. This yellow can go a little more into some bloom. I'm not going to stroke it. I'm just going to drop in some color. Just touch it in. It was a very pale yellow, but mainly water. So that's picking up the colors, moving them to the side. What I'm waiting for over here is for this area to begin to go a little matte. You can see how shiny it still is. That's a lot of surface water. You sprinkle salt on that. What happens is the salt dissolves. If it's too dry, like over here, the salt will just sit on the surface, nothing will happen. You want it just beginning to dry. So I'm amusing myself with some other things here. And I'm going to spray that. Let's see what happens if I move that over with that spray bottle. Okay, this is beginning to set up and dry in here. Let's see if I can show you. See, it's beginning to go a little less shiny. Just a little less shiny in here. Oh, I rocked the paper. I moved the water back over it. Okay. I'm hesitant to pause the video because I want you to get a real feel for the dry time. Okay, so I have here a pinch of salt. This is just regular table salt. Now, you don't want to leave big piles of salt. Let's see if you can see the little bits of salt I put on. Now this has to develop. This one I am going to pause the video because that's going to take at least 10 to 15 minutes to develop. The temptation to put more salt on is great because you're like, oh, there's hardly any salt there. There's salt. Give it a chance. Okay, well, finally, the salt area has dried, and you can see the difference. This is the salt where I sprinkled it, and where the paper was buckled, those little salt areas started to flow in certain areas. You could see they're like very crisp little blooms. Now I put the salt into a wet area that was over an area that had dried. So there's a difference in the way here where the salt went down onto areas that were already light when the wash was down. They picked up that lightness. This area had already been painted. So now the salt lifts, but not all the way to where it had been dried. This is the spatter from the spray bottle. It's got a slightly different quality to it. So, salt, spray bottle. Now, if I wanted to re-wet an area, and I'm going to do this with the brush, I can come in, I could come in with my 2-inch brush, and since I'm talking wet and wet today, I'm not even going to preserve areas. Normally I'd go, let me preserve an area. Just because. Okay. Now I'm coming around. And I'm laying in the water, not being all that pristine about it. The more you stroke, the more you might lift. So you don't want to do that too much. See, there's an area that's beginning to lift. So, let's see. I'll come across this way. Make sure I've got everybody damp. And pull off a little of the excess. So, I've been asked, well, how do you still maintain the wet and wet quality if things have dried? Well, I just re-wet. It's loosened things up a bit, but if I come in, it's got that soft edge. I'm back to the soft edge. And I can rock the paper. And come around and get some denser color in there. If I want to come in to an area that I had preserved as dry, that's going to give me a crisper edge. But I can wet the brush. So this time I'm not doing it with a spray bottle. This time I'm going to use the brush, and it won't give me the speckling. Pull up that excess. Oops, maybe I pulled up a little too much. Okay, so you can see I'm being fast and loose here, but I did want to show you different ways of thinking about wet in wet for handling composition. I can come in with even denser pigment because there's so much moisture here. Now that's not going to dry that dense, that darkly, that densely. Do you see how dark that is? There's so much moisture on the page, that will be lighter. It won't be that dark. So let's see, let me get a little bit of that green just to give you a different green there. You can see I'm really soaking wet on this. Now some artists work entirely in wet and wet, and they love this amazing soft atmosphere that you can generate. Check the paper that you use. Some papers are very absorbent, which is great for handling huge flows of water. It'll suck it up. You have to work a little quickly because it's going to suck the water up. The paper's going to buckle more if it's more absorbent. Now, if I want to pull up a little light, come back in, pull up a light, you can do that. You can see I'm blotting the brush. I don't want to go back and forth and make a mess, a muddy mess, but I can do that. And that's a lift. That's drying out the wetness. If I came in with more moisture, the brush now has water on it. With luck, I'll have a little bit of a bloom edge eventually. So you can see the different edges I'm generating in here, where the water is pushing out into the dark, where that water that I just put down is pushing out a little bit into the middle tone. Some areas are very loose. There's streaks here where the water just dripped down. They're barely there. If I want to fix them later, I can. But this already has an abstraction and a beauty to it that I could work with this. I don't need to do too much more. I want to show you one last thing. Oops, hello. Oh, this is the photo that I was working with. I was not being particularly specific. Now, this is the same photo. I'm using it as inspiration, but this one started out wet on dry, where I put down that large, loose wash, yellows into greens. On top of dry paper, I let it dry as a loose wash. Then I came in, after that wash was dry, I came in with glazes of wash. So the edges are much more controlled. That's the big difference between wet on dry and wet on wet. These edges are very controlled. These edges are much looser. I'm letting the water move things around a lot more. So, I hope you go out, play in the paint, and have some fun.